Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Rukmini Banerjee, and I'm so excited to welcome you all to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. To all the parents, welcome. I hope you've enjoyed the CMC programming this weekend, and hopefully you find the ath experience sufficient as well. Also, a warm welcome to Buzz Woolley, who graduated from CMC in 1959 and helped fund the Woolley Athenaeum Fellows, one of which I am. So a warm welcome from me as well. We take for granted our contemporary understanding of the Constitution. Today, it is an indisputable fact that the seminal text equally protects the fundamental rights of citizens, irrespective of race or gender. However, we often forget how difficult it was to develop and cement that understanding. It was a process that culminated with the Civil War, resulting in 500,000 fatalities, not to mention the lives of all of the Black Americans lost to slavery. To tell us more about this refounding of America, we have with us today Professor Noah Feldman. Professor Feldman is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law, Chairman of the Society of Fellows, and founding director for the Julius Rabinowitz Program on Jewish and Israeli Law, all at Harvard University. His specialty is in constitutional studies, with his focus including power and ethics and the history of legal ideas. He is also a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Feldman has written for various publications, such as the Policy and Public Affairs column for the Bloomberg Opinion, as well as the New York Review of Books. He is also the host of Deep Background, an interview show that explores the historical and scientific, legal, cultural context behind the biggest stories in the news today. Professor Feldman is the author of 9 books. Some of his works include The 3 Lives of James Madison, The Genius, The Partisan, The President, published in 2017, Scorpions, The Battle and Triumphs of FDR's Great Supreme Court, published in 2010, and What We Owe Iraq, War and the Ethics of Nation Building, published in 2004. He is also the author of 2 casebooks with Kathleen Sullivan, and one on the constitutional law and the other on the First Amendment. Professor Feldman's experience also extends beyond research. In 2003, he served as a senior constitutional advisor to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, and subsequently advised members of the Iraqi government on the drafting of Iraq's interim constitution. He also delivered the opening statement at the impeachment trials of former President Donald Trump. Today, Professor Feldman will deliver the Salvatori Center's Spring 2023 Lofgren Lecture in American Constitutionalism. In his talk, he will reference his latest book on the broken Constitution, Lincoln, Slavery, and the Refounding of America. In the book, Professor Feldman articulates his argument that Lincoln broke the Constitution in order to remake it. Professor Feldman argues that Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address was a prefigure of a second Constitution that fully actualized the principles in the Declaration of Independence. Professor Feldman guides the reader to contend with the failures of the old constitutional order and underscores how difficult it was for America to overcome its inadequacies. When reviewing the book, CMC professor George Thomas described it as a timely reminder that the task of maintaining constitutional government is ongoing, the work of present generations building onto the past. Before we get started, a few quick reminders. Please take this time to silence and put away your cell phones. We have an amazing lecture for you today. Be present and get ready to engage in dialogue and ask thoughtful questions. As usual, video and audio recording is strictly prohibited. Welcome to the Athenaeum.
Thank you so much, Rukmini, for that generous introduction. Thank you all for being here. It was a delicious dinner. Earlier today, I also had a delicious lunch. We had boba tea that was substantially better than the kind we get in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I had formed the view that you just eat extremely well here at CMC until somebody pointed out to me that it's also Parents' Weekend. And so I hope you eat like this all the time. What I would love to do is to sketch for you the basic structure of the argument that I made in the book that Rukmini mentioned, The Broken Constitution, and use it to shed some light on some of the hardest problems of constitutional design that face anybody who wants to live inside an evolving constitutional order. That is a constitutional order that changes over time because societies change over time. And I'm going to try to keep my comments to the relatively shorter side so that I can engage with as many of you as possible in question and answer, and you should feel free to ask me questions when the time comes about what I have to say, but also about anything that you'd like to ask me about, because we're here, and we already had a great dinner, so, you know, why not? When Abraham Lincoln became president in March, because it used to be in March that you took office, of 1861, he faced a situation unlike that any president has ever faced before or since. 7 states had already seceded from the Union, or purported to secede from the Union. More were poised to follow. And the constitutional order as it had existed since 1787, when the Constitution was drafted, and 1789 when it was ratified, was well and thoroughly broken. It had been broken. And he had to figure out what to do about it, and he understood perfectly well that his response would be determinative for how future generations would look back not only at the Constitution, but at the whole idea that one could experiment with constitutional Republican government at all. And we know that he thought that because he said so in his first inaugural address. Now, picture yourselves at the Lincoln Memorial. How many people here have visited the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C.? Okay. So you go in, it's a fascinating building, right? It's a Greek temple. It's modeled on a Greek temple. And when you expect to see Athena telling you that you're in Athens, which is appropriate when you're in a room called the Athenaeum, and that's not a coincidence, obviously. It's because, there's a whole history to this, but it's because Americans in the early 19th century imagined ourselves as participants in a new Athens, and we imagined that in Athens, people, it wasn't in fact all people, but neither were we an inclusive society at the time, would discuss important matters of public life and public affairs with one another in public space. And so that's why Athenaeums started being founded all over the United States, and that tradition continues into the 20th century, and we're sitting and we're participating in a ritual that's actually influenced by at least a vision of ancient Greece. And so maybe it's not so surprising that Lincoln is enshrined in such a space. So now you walk in, you see Lincoln there, and you look to the right and to the left, and each one has a short, famous speech by Lincoln. And everyone remember what the two are? Anyone? What are the 2 speeches? Gettysburg Address, yep. And what's the other one? Second inaugural. Excellent, you got it right. So I bring this up because until I went to work on the research for this book, I had never sat down and read the first inaugural, which is notably not on the wall. I sort of remembered the last line, which has to do with the mystic chords of memory, which is a kind of cool line, but that taken out of context doesn't tell you much. And it turns out there's a reason that the first inaugural has not gone down in history. And it's because most of it is devoted to Lincoln announcing that he lacks the constitutional authority to do anything about slavery, that he does not want to do anything about slavery, that he pledges beyond any hair splitting, he's clear, he says, beyond any hair splitting, that he would never want to do anything that would change the status of slavery. And he says that he's perfectly happy for a new constitutional amendment that would make the protection of slavery permanent, because he said that wouldn't change what we already have in our Constitution. So now you know why that speech is not on the wall. So that worldview reflected Lincoln's view the entire time that he was in public life, more than 25 years, from the moment that he first stood up and tried to run for public office as a young man until the time that he was already elected President of the United States. And it didn't even end then. Some 6 months later, on September 22nd of 1861, with the war going quite badly, I would say, I think anyone would say the war was going quite badly for the North, Lincoln reiterated in a letter to one of his friends that it would be, and he knew that letter was eventually could be made public, that it would be an act of dictatorship, his word, for the President of the United States to unilaterally free enslaved people. And if you want yet a further proof that it wasn't just rhetoric, one of his generals, a man called John C. Fremont, who had been the Republican candidate for the presidency in 1856, 4 years previously, actively purported to free the enslaved people who were living in his military jurisdiction in Missouri. And Lincoln wrote him a letter saying, you have to countermand that order. And Fremont said, this is what happens when you appoint generals from the political class, no. And Lincoln said to him, fine, you're fired, and I'll reverse the order. So he did. So this was his private view, his public view, and his policy view. 1 year to the day after that letter that he wrote to his friend explaining that it would be dictatorship to purport to free enslaved people, September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln issued the draft Emancipation Proclamation, which would go into effect on January 1st, 1863. So in that 12-month period, and broadly speaking, the first 18 months of his presidency, Lincoln underwent a radical shift in his own views about what the Constitution authorized him to do, and effectuated through that the act of issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. And I should just note, it's kind of, for a long time it was standard to say that Lincoln emancipated the enslaved people when he did so. I think most historians today would say that Lincoln didn't emancipate anybody in practice because his Emancipation Proclamation, as I'm sure you know, only applied to enslaved people who were living under Southern control. So nobody within his legal jurisdiction was actually freed, which means that what he was essentially doing was issuing an invitation to enslaved people to self-emancipate by leaving their purported masters and promising them that they would effectively not be returned to slavery. A promise which meant something because at least some generals had returned escaped slaves who escaped the Northern lines to their masters behind Southern lines. That had, believe it or not, actually happened. So we say that Lincoln emancipated the slaves. That's a formally, legally state-correct statement. It's not very historically nuanced. Nevertheless, it was a hugely significant event, and he understood it to be so, and global observers understood it to be so. And in one of my favorite things that I came across in the course of researching the book, I found Karl Marx writing a newspaper article in the immediate aftermath of emancipation saying that this was a historic act, quote, tantamount to tearing up the original Constitution. Now, was it tantamount to tearing up the original Constitution? That seems like an interesting and important question. Because if it was, then Lincoln genuinely broke the US Constitution, perhaps in order to save it. And I'll come back to the question of what that means in a moment. If, on the other hand, Lincoln just was acting according to a new and better interpretation of the Constitution, then you might say Lincoln never broke the Constitution. He just changed his opinion about what was authorized under the Constitution. It's interesting to note that Lincoln himself never directly admitted publicly that he lacked the authority to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Never said so. Now, he did immediately seek, and it eventually came, a constitutional amendment that would ratify what he did, so that maybe is some hint. But he never said he was breaking the Constitution, and you can sort of see why. The whole theory on which he went to war to coerce the southern states to remain in the Union was on the theory that they had broken the Constitution and lacked the authority to do so. So if he had admitted that he himself was breaking the Constitution, that would have undermined the central justification for the whole war. And in fact, Lincoln repeatedly said that the basis that he had for going to war was that he had an oath registered in heaven, another great phrase from the first inaugural, to enforce the Constitution, and that therefore he had no choice but to go to war, which was not the conventional wisdom at the time. In fact, the Buchanan administration, the previous administration, had issued an official Attorney General's opinion, followed by a State of the Union address by Buchanan, explaining that although the southern states acted unlawfully when they seceded, it was beyond the power of the president to coerce them to return. because that would violate the consent of the governed, and the consent of the governed was the principle on which the whole constitutional republic was originally founded. So what happened to Lincoln over this roughly 18-month period of time? The answer that I offer in the book is that he had a two-stage process in which he changed his beliefs about what had to happen. And there were the two key stages. I guess I would say it's two stages plus one political reality. The political reality was he was not doing well in the war, and that was consistently true through most of that period of time. The two-stage process was that Lincoln had to change his own view of the Constitution twice before issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. And each time he violated the Constitution as it was broadly understood. The first was simply by going to war unilaterally without even the approval of Congress to coerce the southern states to return. And Lincoln talked himself into this, and we know this from the speeches that he gave to Congress, especially the speech of July 4th, 1861, in which he declared that it must be a principle of the Constitution that states could not voluntarily secede, because if they could, they would always be able to use the threat of secession to extract whatever concessions they wanted from the other states. Now, if you think about it, that argument, seen from the standpoint of the era of the framers, is not very compelling, because extracting concessions is what people always do in a negotiation. And indeed, the Constitutional Convention in 1787 in Philadelphia was one long series of extracted concessions, ultimately issuing in a series of compromises. The most famous one, the Great Compromise, was between the big states and the small states, and that took a walkout by the small states who just said, we're going to have equal representation in the Senate, and if you don't give it to us, we're gone. But the second compromise, which turned out to be even more consequential, was a compromise over the nature of slavery. And it was the compromise through which the northern states agreed to the 20-year guarantee on the protection of the international slave trade, on the Three-Fifths Compromise, and most morally indefensibly, not that the others were so morally defensible either, but most indefensibly, the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution, which effectively bound the northern states to enforce race slavery by saying that if an enslaved person escaped to one of their states where slavery was not lawful, that state would return the person to an enslaved condition. So that was the initial compromise structure of the Constitution. And through those compromises, it was relatively clear, as Lincoln himself understood, that the states ratified the Constitution and they could unratify it, which is exactly what the seceding states did. They, in fact, held special unratification or secession conventions. They didn't do it by a popular vote. They did it in convention because they had ratified in convention. So first thing Lincoln had to do was convince himself that it was justifiable despite that to coerce them to remain, and he came up with a theory to do it. Then Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, the fundamental right not to be arrested and held without charge, even though under the Constitution it was pretty clear that only Congress could do that, because it's in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, which comes right after the long list of all the things Congress can do, and is in the part of the Constitution, Article 1, that's about Congress. Lincoln did it on his own. He then went to Congress and said, hey, I did this thing. I did a thing, I guess is how we would say it today. And would you ratify it? And they were like, no, we won't ratify it. And they refused to ratify it for almost 3 years. And during that time, he maintained the suspension of habeas corpus, and he used that suspension to suppress freedom of expression in the United States to a far greater degree than anyone has ever done in US history. Something between 25 and 40,000 people were arrested and held without trial, without bail, without anything else, for speaking up either in favor of the Confederacy, in which case maybe one doesn't feel that sympathetic towards them, but also sometimes for just saying the war is going badly, or we should end the war, or other views that Lincoln thought were tantamount to support for the South. So Lincoln got himself into the habit of effectively breaking the Constitution. And in the course of that long process of arguing in favor of his right to suspend habeas, he developed a new theory. And that theory was the necessity theory of the Constitution, in which he said, I need to win the war because I need to preserve the Constitution. And so anything I have to do to win the war is constitutional. Okay? And he articulated this theory very explicitly, and he used it ultimately successfully to suspend habeas. That turned out to be the theory that a year later he used to justify emancipation. He said, I need to win the war. Emancipation will create incentives to enable me to win the war, so it's constitutional. Now, it's not really clear what incentives it did in fact create. It didn't give an incentive to Southern slaveholders to give in, because they were being told they would never get their slaves back. In fact, arguably, it gave them an incentive to fight till the bitter end. Furthermore, although some enslaved people did join the Union armies and were used in battle and did help the Union armies, it's very far from clear that their participation was decisive in the war. It was heroic, by all means, and noble and self-sacrificing, but not clear that it was determinative. So that necessity argument was not the greatest argument in the world. So why did Lincoln do it? And here I come to the crux of my suggestion to you, and I'll present it, and then I'll talk about its consequences, and then I'll open it up. He did it, I believe, because he came to understand that the compromise that I was talking about, the slavery compromise, embedded in the original Constitution, was the thing that had ripped the Union apart, and that the Constitution could never continue to function as a mechanism of running the country so long as that compromise remained in it. Now, let me be really clear. What I just said is not on its face a very moral argument. Lincoln himself did not care for slavery, and he thought the practice was immoral. But for his whole public career until he became president, including that initial inaugural address, he took the view, very common among even anti-slavery Northerners, that the compromise in the original Constitution was justified because it was necessary to preserve the Union. Couldn't have signed the Constitution without it, couldn't have expanded the United States westward without the participation of all of the states, and for that, race slavery had to be upheld. The compromise was necessary. However, that same compromise also deeply destabilized the Union because it created a constant dispute about whether newly acquired territory would be slave territory or free territory. So the compromise that was necessary for the expansion of the Union also held within it the seeds of its undoing. And what Lincoln came to believe was that that controversy could only be solved by once and for all putting an end to slavery. And although the text of the Constitution couldn't get him there, and although the consent of the governed couldn't get him there, he would get there by claiming its necessity. And in so doing, he would, to a certain extent, offer that necessity defense as a fig leaf for his act of transforming the Constitution. Now, I think this leaves us with two questions, at least. One is, did he really deep down believe he was breaking the Constitution or upholding it? And two, was he right? Was he right to do what he did? Now, on the first one, no one can give you the definitive answer of what Lincoln believed in his heart, because he didn't write that down. All you can do is look at his process of telling himself the story of necessity. And I think it's plausible to say that Lincoln convinced himself to believe the opposite of what he'd always believed about the Constitution. But to do that, you'd have to believe that he was capable of a significant amount of what in ordinary language we would call self-delusion. He knew what he had said a year before. He knew what he had said his whole career. And he also knew that he wasn't saying it anymore. In fact, he was saying the opposite of it. My own view is that it's more likely than not that he understood that he was breaking the old Constitution, the Compromise Constitution, and that he was insisting that he wasn't doing that because it would render his argument inconsistent with the whole theory of the war. He had found himself in the grips of a fundamental contradiction. He was fighting in a war to preserve the Constitution, but if he preserved the Constitution the way it existed, the war would not lead to the outcome that he wanted. So that's my own view about that. Was he right? To my mind, he was obviously and clearly morally correct. He was obviously morally correct that the compromise Constitution, with its acknowledgement of and embrace of slavery, could never become a moral basis for sustaining a common union, because it wasn't thought to be a moral basis by almost anybody in the pre-war period. Even the supporters of the Constitution saw the Constitution as an amoral or perhaps immoral compromise agreement. So I think Lincoln was ultimately morally justified in breaking the Constitution in order to offer an opportunity for the country to reformulate itself into a new constitutional form. Now, how could he explain this to the people of the time? And I think I'll come close to closing here, although I'll say another word about the future. He did it by relying on the tool of common moral intuition that was most powerful for 19th century Americans, and that was Protestant Christianity. He looked to Protestant theology, broader Christian theology, but in his case, the Protestant version, and he found in it an example of how an old law could be simultaneously broken while also being affirmed. And his model for doing that was the idea of Jesus Christ as bringing a new dispensation, which both replaced the old law, the law of the Old Testament, with a new law, but also affirmed the original covenant that it was breaking. Now you might say, but wait, how did that solve the logical problem? Because it's not like that theology makes logical sense. It's a matter of faith. It's a mystery. And the answer is that's why it was so good for Lincoln's purposes. It was intuitively understandable by the 99% of Americans at the time who were Christians and the 80-odd% who were Protestants. And it was a mysterious affirmation. He was able to borrow the mystery of religion and impose it on our constitutional order. And we unconsciously went with that, so that today we ourselves can't quite say whether Lincoln broke the law or affirmed the law. We also care about it so much that if you do so much as say in a book, as I have now said, that Lincoln broke the Constitution, many, many people, including scholars of Lincoln, will become very angry at you. I would advise you not to do that, or not to do that until you have tenure. People get very angry about it. They don't want to hear that. And the vehemence with which people talk about an issue like this reflects the quasi-religious nature of people's feelings about Lincoln, who, after all, is deified in a temple in Washington, D.C., sitting where Athena is supposed to be sitting. If you mess with Lincoln, you're messing with people's quasi-secular, quasi-not-so-secular God. Now, what's the takeaway for constitutionalism today? I started writing the book before Donald Trump became president, and when he became president, and as his presidency proceeded, I got more and more scared of my own conclusion. Because I did not want to write a book during Donald Trump's presidency saying that sometimes it is justified to break the Constitution for reasons that I suppose should be obvious. And, I will tell you now that my view is that only in the most extraordinary circumstances in which the fundamental constitutional order is itself immoral, and in which the nation cannot, or the state cannot be saved without this kind of action, would it ever be justified to take such action. And it won't shock you to hear that I do not think that January 6th was such a situation. I don't think it's immoral that we have a system of government in which the person who's elected gets to be president. Don't think that's immoral. I think that's kind of good. Nor do I think it should be obvious, that our constitutional order was so existentially broken by the election of November 2020 that our system needed to be disrupted. And thank heavens, it ultimately was not. So it's only under the most extreme conditions that this sort of thing could be morally justified. And yet those circumstances existed. So the takeaway for me from that is that if you want to live under a constitutional order that lasts well over 200 years, which, by the way, is a strange thing to want to do. No country on earth other than us thinks that's a good idea. Other countries, when things get existential, they change their constitution. So those of you who study comparative politics know that in France we're living under the Fifth Republic. And once I was advising a client who shall remain nameless in Silicon Valley, but a very smart person, who, like a lot of Silicon Valley people, dropped out of college because why not? And I made a reference to the French Fifth Republic, and the person said, "What's that?" And I said, "Oh, that's like France 5.0. Because every time France had a constitutional revolution, they just update the software and reboot the thing. Sometimes it goes well, sometimes, like in the French Revolution, maybe not so well. But like most countries, the French acknowledge the transformation. We don't. We never want to admit that we're updating the software. We never want to admit that there's a new version. So if you're like that and you have that view, you have to be willing and prepared sometimes to pretend that a transformation isn't happening when in fact it is. And that's risky business, because you're at least lying to the world and sometimes lying to yourself. And it's usually a bad idea in any important life decision to lie to yourself. I mean, it's also usually a bad idea to lie to other people, but it's a really bad idea to lie to yourself, because then you don't even know you're lying. Or some part of you doesn't know you're lying. So we want to be really careful in that mode when we think about our own constitutional practices and traditions, really careful about not thinking that every element of them is unchanging, or that every element of them was perfect. And I have friends and colleagues and people I deeply respect who think it's a really risky thing for us to acknowledge that the Constitution of 1787 was founded in substantial part on an immoral compromise around slavery, because they say, well, that will erode faith in the Constitution. To which my response is, it did, and that's why we had a civil war. Like, that happened. Then we changed the Constitution, first by Lincoln's unilateral action and subsequently by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and we can be grown up enough to admit to ourselves that that was, as Lincoln put it, a new birth of freedom. Language that it was self-consciously Christological, but also acknowledges the newness of it. So I believe that we do best as a people, including in our eras of deep division, and we're still in one, maybe not quite as bad as it was 3 or 4 years ago, but it's still not pretty out there. We do best when we trust ourselves to be honest about where we've come from, because that will facilitate our capacity to go forward. We have to be a country of grown-ups. We have to be, because we have grown-up problems. So we need to respect ourselves and one another enough to be honest about where we've come from and honest about how we've changed, and also honest about the imperfection of our accomplishments. And so I'll just conclude by saying nation-making or nation-building is not a process that you do and is then over. It never stops. It never stops. If you want to retain an identity as a nation or as a state or as a people or as a constitutional republic, you have to evolve. It's an evolve or die situation. And so in order to evolve, you should be honest with yourself and recognize that sometimes that evolution is so transformational that it amounts to breaking something you had before and starting again. So thank you very much for listening so kindly, even when you had your desserts in front of you, and attentively, and I would love to answer questions. And I think there are microphones that will circulate so that everybody can hear you.
I'm sure there are many questions we all have to
Don't
ask.
be shy, please. Otherwise, I'll have to lecture at you more, and you don't want that.
Exactly. So now we're going to start the Q&A portion of the evening. So for any student or parent who has questions, please come up to the mic and ask them. Keep your questions brief. We ask only one question per person. We're sure there will be many of you. So try and respect that. For students, make sure to introduce yourself, say your name, your major, as well as your class year. For parents, you can figure it out on your own. We also do ask that students do have priority, even though parents are welcome to join.
Go ahead, you're closer to the mic.
First. That's a little low. Hi, I'm Luke. I'm a freshman at CMC. I'm majoring in environment, economics, and politics. And you were talking a lot about, sort of at the end of your speech, us being a country of grown-ups, right, and us being honest with ourselves. But the reality of the matter is that a lot of people aren't honest with themselves, and that's why we have so many of the problems that we have right now. And at the time of the Civil War, when we were so divided, part of the reason, like as you talked about, that we were able to change the Constitution was because of Lincoln, a strong leader maybe acting outside of his purview, as a leader, right? So would you say that in a realistic situation, in a country where people aren't perfect and people aren't being honest with themselves, there's a place for leaders who act outside of their democratic responsibilities to make change in extreme circumstances? And would you say that we as, thoughtful people should accept that, even when it seems undemocratic?
That's a really deep and provocative question, so thank you for it. My view is that if our democracy were fundamentally in danger, if our divisions were so deep that we could no longer collectively self-govern, there might be a need comparable to the need we faced in the Civil War, when we were, in fact, actually on the brink of and then at war, actually killing each other. I don't think we're anywhere near there today. I think what we have is deep and meaningful political disagreement on a wide range of issues, but I think simultaneously that there's a depth of agreement nationally on many high-level principles. People don't agree about how to effectuate those principles at all, but they still believe in those principles. And I think to the extent that that remains the case, what we need are leaders who have the courage to say, here's what these principles mean to me, vote for me, and as for the people on the other side, I respect their right to have alternative views to my own, and I think they're dead wrong. I think we would do very well to remember in the course of that kind, the reason I say that takes strength, because that used to be totally banal. The parents in the room recognize that that's just like what every politician said until about 5 or 10 years ago. Everyone ran to the middle, right? To a first approximation, Bill Clinton ran to the middle. George W. Bush ran to the middle. So did H.W., right? Barack Obama, to a significant degree, ran to the middle when he was first running for office. It was just the most simple thing to say, the people on the other side are well-meaning people, right? I don't agree with them for this and that reason. We've lost that now because of something good that we've done and something that we've taken a little too far. The good thing we've done is to remember that there are moral issues in politics, that not everything is purely a matter of practical compromise, because if everything is a matter of practical compromise, you can do what we did in 1787 and compromise on slavery, and it'll come back and haunt you. So it's good that we have a recognition of morality. What's unfortunate, because we've taken it too far, is we've made the false inference that because there are moral disagreements, and because we deeply believe that we are morally correct, which is fine, you should believe that about morality, you don't have to be a relativist, that it follows that the other side is evil. That's not a correct logical inference. The other side might be mistaken, but they also probably sincerely believe in their point of view and sincerely believe that it derives from first principles that we share. So we're actually in the position of disagreeing with people with whom we share premises, which is not an environment in which you get very far by saying to the other side, you are evil. But we're doing it. And there is plenty to blame on both sides of the aisle with respect to that tendency. And it is not going to last, mostly because it can't work. You can't hold a country together. You can't hold a meeting together. You can't hold a friend group together if, when you have a disagreement that's serious, you conclude that the other side is fundamentally immoral. And since our country, in fact, cannot be broken apart, realistically, there's no way to do it. And when people fantasize about, oh, we should have, break the country apart, and it's obviously preposterous from a practical standpoint. And so we therefore have the only other option, which is to recognize that we can disagree, including disagree over morals, without concluding that anyone who doesn't share my morals is an evil person with whom I will not speak or associate. A republic cannot sustain itself that way. It just can't. Now, right now, to say what it would have been completely banal to say a few years ago has come to seem like it requires some bravery. And I find that sad, but it's just the way it is, And we'll get back to the sensible point of view. We'll get back to it, but we're not there. We're really not there yet. That's a message to the kids in the room, fundamentally. Maybe you guys are the generation who will bring it back to something resembling common sense, and you'll have to do it on your own because, we, your parents, are sufficiently old that anything we believe or say, you rightly regard with substantial skepticism. And so you just have to figure it out for yourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk, Professor Feldman. My name is Henry Long. I'm a sophomore at TMC studying philosophy, politics, and economics. You mentioned that in some situations, like the Emancipation Proclamation, there are certain moral principles which justify kind of a rethinking or a breaking of the Constitution, in your words. This seems to introduce kind of a problem of constraint where you're appealing to moral principles outside of democracy to constrain the processes of democracy. How do we know which moral principles we should be appealing to justify those changes, especially when, like you mentioned, those moral issues are so very fraught?
That's another really, really excellent question. Whoever's teaching you political philosophy is winning. So I think that it is, in the end, a myth, maybe a useful myth, but a myth nevertheless, that we could enter into a political community and at that moment of entry bracket ourselves and say we're never going to ask the question anymore about what moral principles would justify our getting out of it. It's appealing, right? Once you're in a system, you don't want there to be a revolution. And so it's really nice to say, well, you can't appeal to that principle because that would be a revolutionary principle. But as the Declaration of Independence demonstrates, you can be in the system, the way the signers of the Declaration were subjects of the British Crown, and you can just declare, based on, in that case, Lockean natural law principles, that the political arrangement that presently exists is unjust, and so you're out of there, right? And you're willing to stake your life and your sacred honor on it, right? Now, is that a revolutionary act? Yes, that's a revolutionary act. But I think that, in the end, no political community could successfully exclude there being any moral principles. So now you ask, as you just did, well, okay, which ones? If they're not the ones written in the Constitution, then what? And the answer there is that each person needs to try to ascertain, based on that person's own moral judgment, what principles would justify getting outside the system. And then that person has to go out and try to convince other people, unless the person wants to end up either being considered mad or criminally punished. So in that sense, I mean, Donald Trump didn't say it explicitly, but on January 6th, there were people who, some people probably literally believed, of the protesters, literally believed that the election had been stolen. So in their minds, they were standing up for principles of democracy, internal principles, but they had an empirical disagreement about how the votes had been counted. But there were others, and you could see them because they had signs declaring this, who had competing conceptions of what was justified in the process of governance and who didn't really believe that the election had been, quote unquote, stolen literally. They thought that the system should be broken from the outside. Now, will the system respond by putting those folks in jail? Yes, and it is doing so. But the moral arguments that they make have to be responded to on their own terms, rather than being responded to by saying, you can't say that. You can't make such a moral argument. You can. And in fact, sometimes you must. And here I would just invoke the great heir to Lincoln's views, though not from the standpoint of the state, but from the standpoint of the individual oppressed by the state, which is Martin Luther King Jr. So in his letter from the Birmingham jail, and in other writings and speeches, King made it extremely clear that he was attached to the natural law tradition, according to which an unjust law is no law at all. And how do you know that it is no law at all? The only way a human can know anything, moral reasoning. It's moral reasoning all the way down, arguing for the belief that you think is correct. Now, I would argue that in so doing, King was actually articulating an idea that's deeply American, because it could be traced back to the Declaration and to Locke. And that's why a letter from the Birmingham jail is actually, in my view, a state paper of the United States. A state paper written by a person who was imprisoned by one of the states at the time that he wrote it. But it's not a state paper whose philosophy lies radically outside the American intellectual political tradition. It lies centrally to it, notwithstanding that the conclusions that he was reaching about the immorality of segregation were at odds with those articulated at the time by at least some of the organs of the state, not by all, because the Supreme Court had decided Brown by then. So I think that's what it comes down to. And the same way that you couldn't say to King justifiably, well, how dare you advert to these principles that are outside of the constitutional order, he would have said, they're not outside the constitutional order. Our constitutional order recognizes and acknowledges a right to this sort of action outside of the rules when the rules are unjust.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Professor. Thanks so much for your talk. My name is George Ashford. I'm also a politics, philosophy, and economics student and a sophomore here at CMC. One thing that's always struck me as very strange about constitutional law is that the Constitution has not been amended substantially for approximately 100 years in sort of most of the areas that we think about the federal government operating in. But the way that
except for the end of Prohibition, but yeah, you're coming up on
okay,
that. Yeah.
Yes. Anyway,
if you're not 21 yet, that doesn't matter to you. So.
But despite that, the way the federal government has operated within constitutional constraints has changed significantly because of Supreme Court jurisprudence.
Yep.
So I was really struck by, at the end of your speech, your comments around the need for a constitutional order to evolve and to be flexible in some capacity. Does it bother you that we seem to have left that capacity to 9 unelected judges as opposed to a more general way of deciding those questions?
Yes, it bothers me a lot. But let me say a few words about it, since my day job is to study and teach the constitutional law mechanisms whereby we do exactly that. Right? I mean, my con law casebook runs to 2,200 pages, and it's almost all Supreme Court opinions. The Constitution's only like 10 pages in there. So how did we end up here? The framers made the Constitution too difficult to amend. Now, Madison was scared witless, to put it politely, about making it too easy to amend the Constitution because people were calling during the ratification process for a new constitutional convention to add the rights that became the Bill of Rights. And he said, correctly, it would take a miracle for us to reach consensus again. In fact, what he considered miraculous about the success of the Constitutional Convention can actually be explained by a quirky feature of the convention, which is that it had no great prospect of producing a draft constitution. And so all of the people who were opposed to drafting a new constitution didn't show up at the convention. So they got near unanimity just by virtue of who showed. They then left the room, having secretly negotiated this document, and barely got the thing ratified. Because there was no good polling, but we know from the state electors who were the states that elected delegates to their state ratification conventions, nearly half the country, and by the way, that half of the country was geographically distributed in areas not dissimilar from the way we think about red states today, who were deeply opposed to there being any necessity for a constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation. So he knew that if they had to do it again, they'd probably never reach agreement, because the next time, the people who were opposed to change would elect delegates to the convention, and the conventions would fall apart. So he promised that he would get the Bill of Rights adopted. He forced it through, and he really didn't want there to be future amendments. So he made it too hard. It had to be a little hard, but it didn't have to be that hard. And the effect of that was to make it very, very difficult, as you say, for our country to resolve our great constitutional disputes by amendment. Throw in a civil war, and you got people, which did generate 13th, 14th, 15th amendments, but only because they were ratified at gunpoint. They would never have been ratified if white Southern voters had been permitted to express their actual views. They were the defeated in war, and so their states were essentially coerced into ratification. I'm oversimplifying it, but only by a bit. So, and then, as you noted, in the modern era, we barely try, and even when we try, we often don't get there. So what do you do if you're stuck with a constitution? You can't break it without a revolution. No one really wants a revolution. And you know you need to change it because you have to keep it updated, because you no longer live in a republic that is like not quite I-95. Because the republic was not even all, I-95 not even all the way to Florida. And the answer is you have to find some mechanism, and there are different mechanisms that might have been found. Britain evolves its constitution without amendments because it doesn't have a written constitution, but it has an evolutionary mechanism, or a series of evolutionary mechanisms. But it has a greater range of evolutionary mechanisms than we do. We're basically stuck with one, namely Supreme Court decision making. Now, we weren't always stuck with that. Arguably in the FDR years, Congress effectively amended the Constitution by creating the administrative state. But even then, the Supreme Court ultimately had to ratify that process. Over the last 75 years, really since Brown against Board of Education, we've come to rely on the Supreme Court to make our amendments for us. And that's why the Constitutional Law Casebook is full of the biggest and most important disputes. I like to tell students on the first day of constitutional law, this is the only class you will take in law school where there are no unimportant cases and no boring cases. I mean, if you want to teach the law of trust in estates, you could pick any number of cases that aren't of themselves interesting to illustrate the principles of it. It's also why it's much harder to write a good trust and estates casebook than a good constitutional law casebook, because in trust and estates, you have to choose out of the hundreds of thousands or millions of cases. In constitutional law, the Supreme Court tells you what the important cases are, and you edit them and you stick them in the casebook. You have to edit them, which is kind of fun and challenging, but you know which ones have to go in. There isn't like a lot of variation as among the casebooks. Now, is this any way to run a railroad? No, it's a terrible way to run a railroad, and it causes all kinds of upheavals, and it demands the legitimacy of our central institution, the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court can therefore squander that legitimacy. And not to put too fine a point on it, I believe, I'm on the record of saying this, so I won't deny it, that right now the current Supreme Court is in the process of squandering some of its legitimacy, and that makes it that much harder for us to evolve in a way that feels legitimate. It also leads to crises like the ongoing crisis over abortion rights, because after Roe v. Wade, we never got the national consensus over the constitutionality of the abortion right that the constitutional scholars predicted would happen. I mean, it's already happening, say, for gay marriage, across a wide range of social classes, including among people who demographically, at least, 10 years ago would have been strongly against gay marriage and now think it's constitutionally protected and should remain so. but it never happened at that level for abortion rights. And that's a perfect example of why it's a bad way to run a system. The question is, do we have any other alternatives? And here, you could frame on the two sides of the debate Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes and Justice Antonin Scalia, who in many things was a Holmesian. He believed in judicial restraint like Holmes did, but not on this question. Holmes, just over 100 years ago, invented the metaphor of the living Constitution, invoking, among other things, the Civil War, which he had fought and bled and lost friends, as proof for the proposition that our country today, when he was writing in 1919, had needs, using Lincoln's necessity argument, and had changed and evolved in ways that made it preposterous to govern it the way it had been in 1789. And that metaphor of the living Constitution, to my mind, continues to be convincing and powerful. It was influenced by Darwinian evolution, and the idea is if a species doesn't evolve in the face of changed conditions and circumstances, it will go extinct. Scalia thought that we shouldn't have a living Constitution, and he would say, somewhat humorously, he was a very funny guy, and I'm not just saying that, someone ran a study, my friend Jay Wexler ran a study of all the times in the Supreme Court transcripts that it said laughter, and he asked how many were Scalia, and out of the 9 justices, I think Scalia had like 65% of the laughters over a 20-year period. He really was funny. And he would give lectures, and he would say, people say the only alternative to a living Constitution is a dead Constitution. I'm one of the people who says that. And he would say, that's what I choose, dead, dead, dead. Which I guess in context was supposed to be funny. And, it kind of was. It was self-ironizing. People don't think of Nino Scalia as a very self-ironizing person, but he could be. To say that we prefer a dead Constitution, though, to me, suggests that we're not talking about a Constitution at all. So, I'm on the Holmes side of that debate. And I think, honestly, most sensible people throughout US constitutional history have been. Where we are now is we have a Supreme Court that denies that the Constitution evolves, even as it actively evolves the Constitution. So I already told you what I think about that kind of story. Last point. Neither side of the constitutional debate can claim to be really consistent on this question. Judicial restraint was invented by liberals in response to the conservative, libertarian Supreme Court of the 1910s and 20s overturning state and federal progressive legislation. And so liberals said, we want judicial restraint. And the minute that they got control of the court under FDR, they gave up on judicial restraint and became activists. Suddenly, the conservatives who had been the activists became the judicial restraint people at the end of the Warren Court, and they have been for most of the last 50 years. And now that they have 5 votes, they're doing exactly what the liberals did, and they're becoming activists. The liberals, for their part, just on cue, are switching back to the way they were in the teens and 20s and saying that now they're in favor of judicial restraint. So what it looks like is that whoever has 5 votes is in favor of activism, and whoever doesn't have 5 votes is in favor of judicial restraint, and I'm ashamed of that. I'm ashamed of that as someone who teaches constitutional law, because I want it to be about consistency, because that's what the discourse demands. And that's what sincere people try to do. They try to make arguments about consistency. So it looks really bad, but I can't escape it. That is the reality of where we currently stand. My only defense of that is that our social practice is to debate intensely and then rely on the rule of 5. And that sometimes rips us apart, but it's the best we've got if we're going to insist on sustaining this rickety old Constitution.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much for your talk. It was extremely interesting. My name is Olivia. I'm a sophomore studying international relations and public policy. You kind of touched on this briefly in your response to the last question, but I'm just wondering what your perspective is on Supreme Court justices who make decisions based on a reading of the Constitution that's based in the context of when it was written as opposed to a modern day context.
Yeah. So I think it makes sense to begin any inquiry into the meaning of the Constitution by asking what it meant to begin with, in the same way that basically any literary text or form of communication, it's a nice place to start by asking, what did whoever wrote this intend? Now, that's not a question you can always answer, sometimes because you don't know, or sometimes the person who did the writing isn't a person at all, but a chatbot. And so now, I mean, it's a good example. You can't ask, what was the original intention of ChatGPT? It's not a meaningful question. It doesn't have consciousness, or at least, I don't know, my son and I were debating this the other day. It's not clear whether it has consciousness. But what it is, if it has consciousness, which I claim it doesn't, it wouldn't be a consciousness like ours. And I guess you could say, well, we could ask it what it intended, but that just creates a recursive problem, right? If there's no person behind there, we can't ask about intent in the ordinary form of the word intent. But it doesn't mean it's unreasonable as a first question. But it's also not the last question that you would ask, because we're always interpreting for a purpose. We're always interpreting to do something in the world. Interpretation is an act. And in my view, if we're interpreting the Constitution, we're interpreting it in order to enable us to live together in the best way possible that sustains and maximizes our capacity to be a just, inclusive, and fair community. You know, and maybe if I were a little more honest, that can also sustain its position of global power. Because all constitutions enable countries to sustain their position of global power. Countries seem to really want to do that. And very few countries have ever self-consciously given up their global power. Some have done bits and pieces of that, but usually it happens unintentionally or by accident. Like you invade Iraq and it doesn't go well. So I think there is also some self-interest. So I'm trying to be honest. There's a self-interested component to the act of interpretation. But that's okay because we have a purpose, and therefore we need to take into account our own present and future objectives when we interpret. If we never looked backwards, it wouldn't be law. Because after all, law is always about a rule that someone has set down in the past that we commit ourselves to following. So we have to look backwards. If we only look backwards, it's not going to lead to a very effective form of government going forward, and the system will break. We manifestly cannot live today as we did in 1787. And even the staunchest originalists will usually acknowledge that we can't fully live that way anymore. And although it would be great if we just relied on the legislature to fix things, you know, our Congress doesn't always do it that way, and we can't amend the Constitution. So what we're stuck with is this interpretive practice. And as I say, I just think the best argument against doing it only in historical terms is that that's just a crazy way to do things, if it were even possible. I actually don't think it's possible. Parenthetically, it's also not what the framers thought. The framers themselves were not originalists, which is a problem for originalists. But that's like a logical trick. That's like a debater. It's true. It's a good debater's point, but it is a debater's point. In the end, the real reason not to be originalist is that it's crazy. You know, you can't possibly want to live today under the same principles that you would have derived in a slave republic with horse and buggy. And that's literally what you're asking for. And you can't, it's just not a plausible way to run anything. You know, and you know, you have a country that wants to be at the cutting edge of a wide range of technologies, that still wants to be a global superpower. And the United States has never been able to accomplish any of those things, not economic growth without effectively changing our constitutional norms, not global military power without effectively changing our constitutional norms. At every moment when the US wanted to change its geopolitical position and enhance the welfare of its citizens, including at the expense of citizens of other places, we had to mess with the Constitution to do it.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Jackson Sharp. I am a first year at CMC, and I'm interested in government and economics. You discussed that it really isn't practical for a society to bracket these moral conversations, but along the same lines of modes of interpreting the Constitution, I was wondering if you could describe the implications of a more moralistic means of interpretation, like common good constitutionalism entering the mainstream.
Yeah, thanks for that. So a really important thing that follows from what I was just saying about living constitutionalism is that the living Constitution does not just automatically say what I want it to say, right? To be a living constitutionalist, you have to admit some version of what I said before, that it's a crazy way to do things looking backwards, or maybe that it's impossible. And as it turns out, both staunch liberals and staunch conservatives have agreed to that position at different times. So you mentioned common good constitutionalism, which is a phrase popularized by my colleague at Harvard Law School, Adrian Vermeule. And Adrian, in his book, Common Good Constitutionalism, fully embraces Ronald Dworkin's theory of interpreting the Constitution, which I won't go into all the details, but trust me, it's living constitutionalism. And he says originalism is bunk. He says it on the first or second page. And this is the guy who, at least among young conservatives on my campus, is the coolest, hippest, you know, maybe that's not exactly what I would apply to Adrian, but he's the coolest, you know, conservative intellectual doing constitutional law today. And so what he says is, originalism is bunk. It's always about, interpreting the Constitution is always about proffering our moral vision. And then he says Ronald Dworkin, who was a staunch liberal, had the wrong constitutional vision. He was right that we have to interpret the Constitution in light of morality. He just had the wrong morality. The right morality that Professor Vermeule offers is sort of Catholic natural law inspired morality that says we should interpret the Constitution to provide for our common good. And then we can debate what is in the common good. And he has his own view about what the common good is. I guess my view is basically that he's correct to say, as was Ronald Dworkin, that you can't actually realistically engage in a constitutional debate by asking what did the framers think, as though that would bracket the question of what should we do. You can't bracket that question. So he's right that we have to fight it out by asking what's the right way to live. And indeed, I think we all, a lot of time, are doing that. That will entail being grown-ups and acknowledging that we're not going to agree always on the right way to live, and sometimes we're going to disagree really radically about really hard moral questions. So how do we do that and then still live together as a country? I think the answer to that is the one I was mentioning earlier. We have to acknowledge that the other side is reasoning morally from common premises, and that we really, really disagree with the other side, but they're not evil people. And I would include in that, you know, Adrian's frankly and openly anti-liberal view. And I don't mean anti-modern liberals, I mean anti-John Locke's natural law liberalism that conservatives, most conservatives, at least who are over 25, still really believe in, because it's in the Declaration of Independence, and it's in the Constitution and the 14th Amendment. You know, the bit about being created equal and having the rights to life, liberty, and property. Now, I'm a little shocked that one of my colleagues, one of my smartest colleagues, doesn't believe that. I mean, it kind of scares me. But I think he's got his own set of arguments based on a natural law tradition, and Locke was also using the natural law tradition. So it's an argument about different forms of natural law reasoning, and it's an argument that reasonable people can have even when they really, really, really disagree. And I want to be clear that he and I really, really, really disagree. And also that the stakes are really high. The stakes are really high. And, you know, if I'm feeling mean, I'll say that, you know, his point of view, by eschewing the Lockean natural law tradition, will break our ability to all agree. You know, that we won't be able to debate if we don't share that premise. If we no longer think with the Declaration that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, if we don't agree on that, I kind of worry a little bit about our premises, especially if we get our premises, say, from Catholic teaching, because some people are Catholic and some people aren't, and nobody believes, including Catholics, that the way to become a Catholic is purely by reason. Right? You have to have faith also. That faith may be perfectly correspondent to reason, but you still need faith. So yeah, that worries me. It makes it harder to disagree if we don't share that common premise. But we can still pull it off. We can still manage. And we certainly have to keep on trying. So that's the game, but it requires civility and willingness to actually disagree, and you can't do that and live together if you're convinced that the other side is genuinely evil. You have to say, this is very dull, but you do have to say this sometimes, the consequences of your view, sir or ma'am or whoever you are, lead us to a conclusion that if we perform that would implicate us in a course of action that I consider deeply morally wrong. You know, you could say that. And you should say that. You have to say that. But saying that they're evil and that you won't talk to them, you know, because they're so evil, you don't want to hear what they say because they're so evil, you wouldn't want to taint your pure ears with their evil. I mean, it's fine. It's just not a way to live together. You're just not going to be able to live together at that point. And I think we need to live together. And we're going to. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is William Thurman. I'm a junior at CMC majoring in history and economics. So I found it really interesting when you pointed out that the geographical distribution of anti-federalists in the Revolutionary era is very similar to what we consider red states today. So I guess my question for you is, what do you attribute that correlation to? Is it sort of a
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this, and you know, when I wrote about this in my Madison book, I was really delicate because obviously we're just talking about the I-95 corridor, so that doesn't account for the whole country. So let me be clear. What I mean is that in the coastal cities, where there was substantial international trade and a concentration of emergent institutions of education, there still weren't very many of those, you got very strong pro-ratification sentiment. And the further you got into the backcountry and to the agricultural hinterland, the more strongly anti-federalist attitudes were held. Right? So there was only one coast, but that coast was where the strong pro-federalist, pro-ratification sentiment was. And as you went inland and into the backcountry, it began to become much more strongly anti-federalist. I think that has a lot to do with the underlying political economy effects of engagement with trade, as opposed to, in that period, agriculture. Today, still to some degree agriculture, but primarily not agricultural. But it's how engaged you are in the immediacy, at least in part, of cutting-edge, globalizing economic activity that I think played a major, major difference. I also think the pace of sociocultural transformation was much faster in those coastal cities than in the hinterland, just because they were more present to international influences and international trade. Capital was much more concentrated there. So to make no mistake about it, ratification was heavily favored by capital, heavily favored by capital. And in fact, according to the famous Charles and Mary Beard interpretation of the Constitution, the whole Constitution was just a trick played by capital in order to assure that the debts that the United States government and the states owed from fighting the revolution would get paid off on the backs of taxes placed on people in the backcountry. And there was something to that interpretation. I mean, it's not, modern historical analysis has undercut many aspects of it. But for example, when Shays' Rebellion took place in Massachusetts, which was one of the things in the run-up to the Constitutional Convention that influenced, for example, George Washington, who did not want to go to the convention because he was on the fence about whether, well, he wanted to be George Washington. He was the most beloved and famous person in the United States, and he had retired from public life back to his farm, and he didn't want to give his credit to the constitutional process until he knew that people wanted it. But Shays' Rebellion put him over the edge. Madison used it to try to convince him to show up. So what was Shays' Rebellion? It was a tax rebellion by farmers in western Massachusetts who said, okay, I don't get this. The government of Massachusetts owes me money because I was a soldier fighting for Massachusetts in the Revolutionary War, and they haven't paid me back, and I'm poor. And now the government of Massachusetts, which is controlled by people in Salem and Boston who are shipping magnates, wants to tax us to raise the money to repay the state's debts, which partly means paying us, but it mostly means paying themselves back because they've acquired a lot of debt on the cheap. So hell no, I'm not going to pay my taxes. And then, thousands of those people got together and shut down a court, which was going to enforce debts. And people in Salem, Massachusetts and in Boston got so scared that they raised a private army and sent out a private army to put down the rebellion. Private army paid for by, you guessed it, the merchants in the coastal cities. And that was the structure that then reiterated itself by the time, ratification came around. Support for ratification came from those cities. So the folks who were saying this is a plot to effectively keep us in a subordinated status, they were not completely wrong. Nor has the history of the United States entirely disproven that concern. We were then, and we remain to a much greater degree today, a country with very powerful egalitarian ideals and a deeply ramified hierarchical structure of life. And, I want to be super clear. I teach at Harvard Law School. It's not like I can be some defender of non-hierarchical, educational capacity. Like all educational institutions that can afford to do so, like this extraordinary institution, we do our best to raise money, to offer opportunities for the broadest possible range of people with different economic backgrounds to attend the institution, so as to enable them to earn and succeed in ways that will place them in a relatively more advantageous place in what is, after all, still a hierarchy. And although I have many colleagues who devote themselves to criticizing that hierarchy full time, and I deeply respect them, they're doing it from within a hierarchical institution. And I think, you know, part of being honest and being grown-ups is to acknowledge that fact. Hierarchy is not always bad. It can be, and when it's permanent and structures injustice, it can be very, very, very bad. But, you know, the people, the anti-federalists, they could smell it. They could smell it. And they lost. And, you know, again, I'll just conclude here. I want to be clear that in saying that Lincoln took away the most fundamentally immoral part of our Constitution, I don't mean to say that the United States Constitution emerged from the Civil War, from the 13th and 14th Amendments, as though it were perfectly just. I mean, for one thing, we then ignored the 14th and 15th Amendments for another 75 or 80 years until the Civil Rights Movement forced us to pay them greater attention. So that injustice of race slavery and of subsequently segregation didn't go away for a very long time and still hasn't gone away in terms of its actual real-world effects. And the broadly, you know, hierarchical structures of our society also are in certain respects still present. Not in every respect, but in certain respects. So it's not like I'm saying that we're perfect. We are way far from perfect, and we're never gonna be perfect. What we have the capacity to do, though, through a moral vision of the Constitution, is try to be better. We can say that our institutions give us the inspiration and the space to try to be less hierarchical and to try to make the Constitution more protective. And one change is that today, it's not like people in red states don't believe in the Constitution. They really, really, really do. Deeply. Deeply. And in certain respects, probably more than people in some people in blue states. Because they're deeply committed, you know, people in red states are deeply committed to constitutional rights and principles and values. It's just part of the long, ongoing, evolving, but with some points of continuity, debate over how to effectuate those principles. And that's just what constitutional self-government is. That's just what it is. It's weird. I wouldn't advise trying it at home. You wouldn't design a system from scratch this way. You know, it's not the most efficient system that ever existed, far from it. But it is, in the end, a bit like, you know, Churchill said, it's the worst system of government except for all the other ones. And so far, no one's yet come up with a better one. I mean, I know people in the Chinese Communist Party might not agree, but I'm going to respectfully stick with our system over theirs for now. Thank you all very much for being such an amazing audience.